So welcome to this masterclass with Bill Morrison, a remarkable documentarian who for 20 years has been working with archival materials and creating some luminous works with working with musicians such as Bill Frisell and Philip Glass. His best-known film, Decasia, was called by Errol Morris, I think maybe the best film ever.
I don't know if he'd finished watching it at that point.
Right, yeah. RogerEbert.com has said, Morrison's world is one of the most breathtaking and haltingly disturbing cinematic realms of our time. So, no pressure. Welcome and thanks.
Thank you, Will. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Ji.hlava. I've heard about this festival for a long time, so it's really great to finally see it. And I always love coming to the Czech Republic. So I'm going to show a lot of work today. So I do want to kind of move along quickly. But what happened is I started answering emails about how this masterclass would go. I started dividing my work into, or observing the categories that had generated the source material. And so I called this class Consider the Source, because we would see how a film really came out of its source material, how I found that material, and whether I was looking for something specifically or if I was inspired by the clip, basically. So the first couple films, and we're just going to look at excerpts. I'll tell you if we're going to look at a film in its entirety, but because we're going to look at an enormous amount of different films here, not too many of them are in their entirety. But these first two were really inspired from single clips. You wouldn't even call them films. They were newsreel outtakes, or maybe a complete take. The first one being Outer Borough, which was taken from a piece of footage that was shot in 1899 of a train traveling over the Brooklyn Bridge. And I took that shot in its entirety and mirrored it and started noticing mathematical ways of dividing it, so that by speeding it up and layering it, I could create a new film. So we're going to watch just a few minutes of that one. And please, when I do cue a film, bring everything down to complete darkness. And I apologize for these abrupt endings. This is the way, the nature of the excerpt. The partner film to this, the other film that was taken from a clip and then extrapolated, looks similar in that it also uses this twin stereo effect, but as opposed to this film, which starts out with the entire take, and then you see successive versions that are faster until it becomes quite an abstraction. With Release, the next film, we isolated a moment in a scene and then expanded both the start point and the end point in successive so that it becomes more of a reveal. And I should also say that in both cases, I was really inspired by the shot itself and thought that it needed to be featured as a longer exploration. And then the music came afterwards. So Outerborough was actually finished as a silent film, a 35 millimeter film, and then I asked my friend Todd Reynolds to compose music for it. Likewise with Release, it has its own soundtrack. It's from a outtake of the Fox Movie Tone newsreel collection, and I was working on an installation in that building that's depicted with my friend VJ Iyer, and VJ, the great jazz composer, created the piano soundtrack. So we'll look at Release next. Ultimately, that builds to a revelation that you are then released from that loop. So, hence the play. It's also it was purportedly the crowd had gathered to see Al Capone be released from that prison, and then somebody appears who's not quite Al Capone. The next is films that were made from a single title, and ironically these two films were both made from the same title, so this is actually two films made from a single title. That title being a 1927 silent feature called The Bells by James Young, and I made two shorts from that, perhaps my best known short, Light is Calling, which we will watch in its entirety but without credits. And then a good portion of The Mesmerist. So together we'll watch a good 17 minutes of these two films combined. They deal with two different characters. In Light is Calling, it's a woman meets a soldier who's on the road, and they fall in love and go into town. And then the second, The Mesmerist, it deals more with the actual characters from The Bells and sort of this ironic anti-Semitic overtone that the film takes that can be better understood from our perspective after the 20th century than when it was made in 1927. So we'll take a look at Light is Calling, and then really I'll just advance it to The Mesmerist. in this case, this print of the bells was a nitrate print, meaning that it was printed on celluloid, and as all films were before 1949. And I imagine most of you know, but that's the very fragile old film stock that's given to decomposition in any number of ways, most famously conflagration, spontaneous combustion. But it also melts or oxidizes in a slower way, and it does so at a different pace than the emulsion that it's coated with. So what you see here was completely organic. This is just the way that the image had melted over time. And what was remarkable about this particular scene is that instead of the film forming a solid mass, as is often the case when it melts this way, you could still unspool it. And so it was kind of a miracle scene. And of course, you can do it so by soaking things, and sometimes they fall apart. But this one was remarkably intact for how incredibly decayed it was. It came from a print that had been deemed redundant by the Library of Congress, meaning that they had another copy of the bells which was in pristine condition, and they were throwing this one out. And this began a relationship with the Library of Congress that continues to this day that I have with them, where if they're going to throw something out, before they throw it out, they put it on a shelf with a Post-it note with my name on it. And so they can say, well, maybe Bill Morrison would want it, or even Bill Morrison wouldn't want it, and then they throw it away. So I've been a very fortunate recipient of that policy at the Library of Congress. And what's remarkable about these two titles, that they both came from the same film, is that 3 of the reels, there was a 7-reel feature, 3 of the reels showed this emulsion deterioration. 4 of them were pristine. So that as I began to understand the nature of the story of the original, The Bells, I started thinking how I could tell the story by using the decayed footage in some scenes and the clean footage in other scenes. So we'll look at, I guess, about the first 10 minutes of what's a 16-minute film. If you like it, you can see the rest of it elsewhere in this program, or in this festival. Thanks. So in this case, the decay became a narrative element where I could use the clean, pristine part of the film to depict a flashback. The other interesting part about this film was, to me, was the rather cavalier murder and disposal of the Polish Jew's body. In 1928, this prefigured the Holocaust. To see it 90 years later, 80 years later, it was, to me, shocking anyway that this type of imagery was used. And I also thought that the original had a somewhat ambiguous moral center as well, because even though this murderer, played by Lionel Barrymore, dies of a heart attack, haunted by this ghost, of the murdered man. He also has set his entire house all right. He's married his daughter off. She's married to the police chief that you saw in the first film, in Light is Calling. They're having a beautiful wedding. Financially, everything is sound because of the gold that he stole. So I thought it was a rather tricky ending to the original film, and in this way, he doesn't get off the hook as easily. So we were looking at first films from a single scene that had been extrapolated, and then these which took a single film, and this in both cases the same film. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my choices in music. With Light is Calling, the music is by Michael Gordon. I've done maybe a dozen films with Michael Gordon, including Decasia, and this was the first film we did after Decasia. And he was releasing a record under the None Such label, and he invited me to listen to the tracks before they were even named, and I chose track 6, and later he told me that was Light is Calling after I'd already cut that film, and I thought that was a beautiful title to keep. So it was really fortuitous to just happen upon a new piece of music like that at the same time I had that footage. And likewise, my friend Bill Frisell, who we heard in the second film, was looking to score a silent film. He asked me if I had any silent films I wanted to work with, and I told him about this project, and he suggested that I use existing tracks of his, pre-recorded tracks from his records, as a sort of as a guide, and then he would write new music. The problem is that this music, which does appear on his trio record with Dave Holland and Elvin Jones, it worked so well that both of us felt like we were better off just leaving it the way it was, and that we would work on a new project where he would write new music in a later date, which we did, and we'll get to that later. So I just wanted to say that with these two films, I'm conforming the image to match a pre-recorded track. The next category is from single collections, and these really take the form of essay films, where I'm examining a single collection from an archive, and then explaining why the archive exists and what the footage means. I would say that it's more of a straight documentary treatment. In both cases, they're very rare films. The first, Reawakenings, are Super 8 movies taken by the neurologist Oliver Sacks, which became the basis of his study, which became Awakenings, the big Robin Williams movie, Hollywood movie, directed by Penny Marshall, and of course, Oliver Sacks' best-selling book. And it tells the story of these patients that he happened upon while working in a hospital in the Bronx who had been catatonic for decades, and he administered a drug called L-Dopa, and gradually, briefly, for that summer of 1969, awoke them from their stupor. So we'll look at that one first. So with that footage, Sachs gave me this cardboard box with all these Super 8 reels in it and said, maybe you can do something with this. So we had it transferred to an HD and started trying to piece together who the different patients were and at what point in the experiment they were. Gradually they peaked to sort of, this was the peak here, where these people who were heretofore absolute zombies became like dancing, waltzing spirits, and then slowly they regressed over the next year. The other piece from this representative of films from a single collection are actually family films of mine that were shot by my grandfather in 1927 in the Ukraine. He had a really unusual assignment, and that was to document Jewish farm colonies in the Ukraine and the Crimea, sort of as a piece of promotion or propaganda for American businessmen who were Jewish American businessmen who were supporting these. And the point was that after communist revolution and Jews in the cities had lost their livelihood and they were moving out into the farms as part of a government program to become more productive. And so city folks who had never touched a pitchfork or a cow before were learning farming techniques at a young at a late stage in their lives, and an American agronomist was teaching them how to do that. So on these completely desolate steppes of the Ukraine, these little enclaves of civilization were springing up sort of as a utopian vision that of course was ill-fated, but it creates this incredible depiction of this moment of hopefulness. I'm only going to show the first few minutes of it, which set up the premise, but we are presenting it here at this festival as an international premiere, so I hope you can get a chance to see the whole thing. This is Back to the Soil. Again, it was shot by my grandfather, James H. Becker, in 1927. I guess what's important about all the films we've seen so far is that the films that came from them were inspired by the shots themselves. In other words, in this case, I knew I had this wonderful footage by my grandfather. I wanted to make a film of it. With Oliver Sacks footage, he gave me this cardboard box. I wanted to make a film out of it. With the bells, I realized that it was working on many different levels, both narratively and also as a piece of experimental film. It was an incredible example of emulsion decay. And with the first two we saw, with Outer Burrow and Release, these were single scenes in and of themselves, maybe a passing interest, but that I thought could be extrapolated and made into full short films. For the second half of the discussion, I want to really look at films where I've gone out and had a theme in mind and looked for footage. like a detective or a researcher would, looking to get from point A to point B to point C to tell a story. And so these could be sourced from a single archive, or they could be sourced from multiple archives. First, we're going to look at those that are sourced from a single archive, and we're going to look at 3 clips from a film called The High Water Trilogy, which is not surprisingly in 3 parts, and it tells the story of sort of environmental doom, first in form of a flood, a hurricane, then icebergs, and then finally a flooded landscape. All these footage was again shot in the 1920s. You can imagine that the same types of problems existed then, and now they're only exacerbated. We can also imagine that the iceberg maybe doesn't exist anymore. But we're going to look at first 3 clips from the High Water Trilogy.
Before I enter my house, I touch the door frame. Before I enter my house, I bow. Before I enter my house, I step up high and then bow low. I pat my pockets for my keys.
With these films, I was looking expressly for signs of environmental disaster from footage many years ago. And I really began the project in 2005 before Hurricane Katrina ravaged New Orleans. So I was looking at aerial footage of floodscapes really quite apart from that, months before that. And then it became informed by that disaster that hit my country. And this film, it was spawned the seed for this film. So it was in some ways informed by current events. With the next title we're going to look at, interestingly, it came from the same multimedia project that spawned the High Water Trilogy, a project for live vocalists and ensemble called Shelter, and the 3 composers being Michael Gordon, who I mentioned before, David Lang, who we heard on Back to the Soil and also in the first 2 parts of the High Water Trilogy, and their third collaborator, Julia Wolf. And this third part is called Porch. It's written by Julia, and it really explores the changing nature of porches as an open place that was inviting to the neighborhood to one that became increasingly closed and private. So we'll take a look at an excerpt from Porch. So these are films that were all taken from the same collection. This one was from the Florida Moving Image Archivist, where residents of South Florida would give their Super 8 footage to this archive in return for a VHS, or probably now a QuickTime movie, and then they would lease the footage out. So this was all from the same family's Super 8 footage of their houses. And the first one we look at, the High Water Trilogy, was all from outtakes from the Fox Movietone newsreel collection that's housed at the University of South Carolina. And I frequently use that collection. There's an extraordinary amount of footage there that was just the outtakes. It's not the edited newsreels, but it's everything that sourced the newsreels. Also from that collection is a film, or I started noticing from going there a lot, that one of the tropes of newsreel photographers was to greet passenger ships as they went across the ocean. Either as they were taking off, departures, or arrivals, they would climb on board and shoot who was either about to take a journey or get off a journey. So you have, it came from the tradition. It was done in still photography for years, probably still is somewhere. But it was taken up by newsreel photographers, so that you created these sort of awkward moments where the subject would stand without much to do in front of a motion picture camera to have their portrait taken. Again, this is by my friend Michael Gordon, Who by Water. We'll look at a few minutes from that. I was invited to do a project about the First World War by the Kronos Quartet, and in this case I delved into my friend's collection at the Library of Congress. I asked them, as far back as 2010, I knew that I would probably be dealing with the centennial of the First World War in some way, and to start putting aside those scraps from that war that weren't useful. And so a collection of World War I footage was accumulated and amassed over a period of about 4 years, and I put it together with a composition by the Serbian composer Aleksandar Vrebalov, and this is performed by the Kronos Quartet. This is an excerpt from Beyond Zero, 1914-1918. So this collection entirely was sourced from the Library of Congress, the nitrate vaults. Most of it's unidentified footage, though in some cases we had little notation. This last very orange footage you saw, highly deteriorated, was from a Chicago Tribune newsreel called "The Other Side of the War," depicting German soldiers. The last film from this particular section, film sourced from a single archive, is again a title that will have an international premiere here at Ji.hlava, and that's The Dock Worker's Dream. We're going to look at a few minutes from that. Of course, you can see it elsewhere in its entirety this week. This footage was sourced from the Cinemateca Portuguesa. It was a project that was really brought by Mario Michelo from Vila do Conde Film Festival. Those of you familiar with that festival, he approached Kurt Wagner and myself when we were juror members at Clermont-Ferrand and asked us if we want to work together on a project. We agreed. Kurt is of the Nashville alt country band Lamb Chop, and Kurt provided me with a track. Mario and I went to the Cinemateca Portuguesa in Lisbon, and I selected a lot of footage and then started editing to Kurt's track, which was a sort of 25-minute ambient with a beat. It was unlike anything I'd heard by him before. And then after he saw my edit and they performed live with it, he cut his piece down and he added a vocal track, and it became The Hustle. So we're going to look at The Dock Worker's Dream, which we released earlier this year. So I want to continue with what's the final section of this masterclass, and that is films that I've created from multiple sources. And really these are some of my more major pieces of work. They involved not just finding footage that I wanted to make longer films from, not just having an idea that I was searching for, but really trying to tell a story through the footage, so that I was asking the footage to perform a narrative role. Because of our time constraints and how much I want to look at here, it's now almost 8 o'clock. We've got maybe 50 minutes. And I know it's very important to the festival that I show a good clip of Dawson City, my most recent film. And I have about 20 minutes queued up of that. So I want to try to get through excerpts from these other titles. We'll skip Footprints, as much as I love it. And we'll start with the film of her, which ties in nicely with Dawson City. Both films are about lost film collections that were recovered and restored, and the story is about how those collections came to be and how they came to be buried. With the film of her, it tells the story of the paper print collection, which was our earliest film collection, which predated motion picture copyright law. In the United States, films that were created between 1896 and 1912 were saved at the Copyright Office as still photographs. There wasn't a Motion Picture Copyright Act until 1912. So these became long rolls of paper negative that were created as contact prints, as continuous photographs, and then they were protected in some way legally this way. These rolls numbered in the thousands and were stored in a basement shelving of the Library of Congress. They were known about sort of as a curiosity, as a legal document that was never called into court. But eventually, towards the middle of the century, through the efforts of one clerk who discovered or brought the rolls out and started cataloging and endeavored to have them restored back to celluloid, and another private eye Hollywood figure named Kemp Niver, who actually restored the films to film, we have what is a very complete collection of early film, of primitive film. Ironically, we have a better record of what was shot between 1896 and 1912 than we do for footage that was after 1912 because of these films, because paper stores longer and better than nitrate film does. It doesn't catch on fire by itself. It doesn't melt. Even though it was stored exposed to the elements, evidently there were rats running in and around them, they survived, and so the film of her is sort of a half-true, half-mythologized story of the paper print collection. We'll look at just the setup for that, the beginning of it, and then we'll look at some of the longer works. These are all features after that: Decasia, The Spark of Being, The Miners' Hymns, The Great Flood, and Dawson City. I'll set up each one.
It's like that old philosophical question. If a tree falls in the wood and nobody's there to hear it, does it really make a sound?
So, as you can see, this is a... we put the lights on. This is a much different approach than anything you've seen so far. I'm telling a very complicated story using the clips, and in fact using the clips of the collection. The paper print collection is used as certain, and then there's other clips that support the story. And so this became a massive treasure hunt. How do I get this shot to tell this part? How do I get this shot to tell this part? And I started looking through many different archives and developing relationships with the archives as I went along. The next film I'm going to show is an excerpt from Decasia, in some ways my best known film, and at least to date. And in this case, I was looking for, again, footage from many different archives, but I was looking for something more, in some ways more specific and in some ways more general. I wanted to show this war between the emulsion and the base, how the emulsion was coming away from the base in nitrate footage. And then I was also looking for imagery that supported that, where there was a fight going on or there was some sort of spiritual transcendence. So I started making lists of where I might be able to find this type of dualism between a spirit and body. And I went through many different archives and found the footage that I thought best exemplified that. We'll look at a few minutes of Takesha. So sometime after that, I was approached by Dave Douglas, great trumpet player and jazz composer, who was interested in doing a project together, and he had a sponsor in Stanford University. And Dave and I started talking about what we might do. And I'd always wanted to do a retelling of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in that I imagined piecing together a new film out of the parts of an old film. It seemed like a natural. So we went back to the text and began recreating Shelley's story as best we could using pieces of other people's films, documentaries, educational, newsreel footage, no narrative footage in this case. And we started with, well, I don't know how many people remember the book, but it begins with an icebound ship that's sets sail, and then the captain of the ship sees a monster run by, and then the doctor run after the monster, and then the doctor's exhausted, and he tells his story. And so I used Ernest Shackleton's exploration that from south, the exploration of the Antarctica, to set up the story, and it's told the doctor's tale, and he gets to one point where he tells how the creature became educated, and for that section I used educational footage to show how the creature taught himself by listening outside a family's cabin home. This is called The Creature's Education. It's an excerpt from The Spark of Being. All that footage was water damage footage that a friend of mine, Skip Alsheimer, who runs an archive called AV Geeks in North Carolina, his basement was flooded by a hurricane, and he was throwing away water damaged prints. And so that entire section came from a hurricane water damaged prints that he sent me. We're going to skip through observations of romantic love, and we're also going to skip the Miners' Hymns because it's screening here. So if you all are interested in seeing that film, please, it'll show before Decasia. I do want to show an excerpt from The Great Flood, which will not be screening here. And again, this was took the form of a historical documentary exploring the history of the 1927 Mississippi River flood, which changed America in many different and profound ways. One of them is that it was another chapter of the Great Migration of African Americans moving from as southern sharecroppers from the south up to the northern cities and bringing culture with them, which then expanded throughout the world. So migration is a chapter of this story, the Great Flood. It's maybe the penultimate chapter, the second to last chapter of the film. And what's remarkable about it is, again, this is newsreel footage, some of it housed in the Fox Movietone collection in South Carolina. And this actually is these people getting on trains to leave the South forever. I think it's quite remarkable. And I was attracted to this footage first in my exploration of flood footage, and then kind of discovering why there was so much flood footage from 1926 and 1927. I built this idea of doing an entire piece about the flood, and then I approached my friend Bill Frisell. We had talked about one day working on a project where he would write something from the ground up. In The Mesmerist, I used a pre-recorded track of his that he was going to write something for, but we decided to stay with the pre-recorded track. In this case, he wrote 78 minutes of original music for me. And this chapter is called Migration. I know we don't have a lot of time left. I did want to excerpt from my newest film, Dawson City Frozen Time. Like the film of her, it tells a story of a lost film collection, and it uses that collection to tell the story, also supported by other archival material, films, and photographs. Dawson City was the end of a distribution line. It's a town way up in the Yukon, about 300 miles south of the Arctic Circle. It was a gold rush town. They built theaters. When silent movies came in, they showed hundreds of films every year. They would throw some of them away. They'd throw them in the river. They'd burn them up. They presented a safety hazard to the town, which was already prone to catch on fire. And ultimately, they buried a collection of them in a swimming pool that they were filling in anyway. So it was a way of getting rid of them. It became an inadvertent preservation project. 50 years later, construction was done in the 1970s. They uncovered something like 1,500 reels, 533 of which survived. We're going to look at a good chunk of Dawson City Frozen Time. It's a 2-hour film. It premiered at Venice this year, and it's played in the New York and London film festivals in Valdivia. We're going to look at, if we have time, I have a 20-minute clip queued up here. If you have to leave, I understand. It's been great talking to you all. Thanks a lot. To thank you all for being such a wonderful audience.